Do you want me to just close this up?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah,
Sure.
I think so.
All right, so I'm just going to introduce our next two speakers. You can tell we're packing a lot into a short time, kind of like a big appetizer right now.
Yeah.
So Sheila Edwards-Lange has served as the Chancellor for University of Tacoma since 2021. And before that, she was the president of Seattle Central College and the vice president and provost for Minority Affairs and Diversity at UW. She serves on a lot of boards. She does a lot of civic leadership. This is somebody I deeply admire. Richard Reeves is a scholar, writer, and speaker focused on boys and men, and he's now president of the newly formed American Institute for Boys and Men. In 2022, he published Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. I actually read that book and went to Richard, and I was like on fire after, and that really deepened our relationship. And he was previously a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. Interestingly enough, he also worked for a deputy prime minister in the UK and started his career as a journalist. So welcome. I'm going to let you take it over, Sheila.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm not sure if our mic is on. Can you all hear me in the back?
I think this is for recording only.
Okay, so for recording.
If anyone starts to struggle, we could use the handheld, so just don't hesitate to say if... Do you want to just do that? Make it easier? Okay, and I'll grab this one as well. Then there's no question about it. Is that okay with you?
That's great.
Yeah.
Do you know where to turn on?
Yeah, you see the red button here?
It's
I'll give you
usually-
this one.
On the bottom.
I think that's on.
It looks like it's on. And I can also project. So thank you so much for the data. I will say one of the things that was not in my resume, and most people don't know, is that I was one of the early co-chairs of the City of Seattle's initiative on boys and men. And as I started doing that work, people asked me, well, why would you do that? You spent your life being a gender equity. I spent 7 years in the College of Engineering on the University of Washington campus, really trying to get more women into engineering, and have done a lot of gender equity focused on women in my career. And I said, because the data shows exactly what you all have seen tonight, and especially for boys of color, and especially for African American men, and that if we don't do something urgently, and especially in our K-12 and higher ed, but primarily at K-12, we have to do something different to get different outcomes for our boys of color. And now the data shows that it's all boys, regardless of any race. So in your work, Richard, maybe tell us a little bit about why you started doing this, and any pushback that you've gotten on this work, because people have told me, like, why would you do this? It's all or none. You're either for women or you're not.
Yeah. Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Is if it's framed in that zero-sum way, somehow to be worried about these real issues of boys and men means to be less worried about the ongoing issues that still faced by many women and girls. It's just a false choice. But unfortunately, it's very often framed in that way. And so what that means is that even if there's very strong data, and there is on a whole bunch of issues we might get into, and I should just quick shout out that as our website is now live. Is our website live? Yes, excellent. AIBM.org. We have some data on there which shows some pretty glaring gaps. Mental health, fourfold higher rate of suicide deaths. Education, we just heard some of that. Just to put a fine point on some of that, I asked Dan, well, just tell me about GPA of over 3, because I understood that a little bit better. And in this state, just over half, 51% of girls get a 3.0 or more, and it's 35% of boys. That's a non-trivial gap, right? And so just understanding that, I think, is important, whilst at the same time recognizing that there's still a whole bunch to do for women and girls. And right now, it's a bit of a fact-free conversation. That's why I love what Dan did, right? And just these debates that float a bit free of the facts, or we just go and choose your facts from the internet based on what you already believed when you started doing the Google search. It's just a real problem. And so just the reason that we've now founded this first and only think tank, non-partisan, research-based, to work on boys and men, is just to get the facts straighter, and also to make sure there aren't people out there who can actually misuse the facts, because right now there's a lot of that going on too.
And as a college president, the data that we've seen for K-12 then replicates itself in terms of who goes to college and who does not. And we know there's a debate going on now about whether everyone should go to college. But we have seen significant differences in terms of men and women enrolling in college since the mid-'80s. And so no one's really talked about it because we have had these really severe gaps in terms of which fields women do go into and what they major in once they get to college. But we have on many college campuses, especially some of the minority serving institutions, and I will say UW-Tacoma is a minority serving institution, but some of those you see 70% female enrollment, and so just a very, very different enrollment patterns once they get to high school because of these achievement gaps that are happening at the K-12 level. So what are you seeing in your data?
I mean, first of all, just want to thank you for your leadership on this issue for many years now. I suspect you've been a lonely voice for some of that time. So glad to join you a little bit later to it. But yeah, so most of what happens on college campuses can be seen in what's happening earlier, right? So given those huge gaps we see in high school outcomes, for example, it's not a surprise that we see the big gaps. So again, to put a data point on it, I think we're so used to just thinking about gender gaps running one way. And of course, a lot of them really do still run the way we're used to thinking about it, including the pay gap, the share of women in politics, how many women presidents have we had again, how much venture capital money goes to women, etc. So there's still, in STEM, still much further to go. We're so used to thinking about it that way that when there are gaps that go the other way, even as strongly as they do, it's uncomfortable. There's a discomfort that comes with this conversation, which I think we need to honor, frankly. But it's not for nothing that the gap on college campuses today is wider than it was in 1972 when we passed Title IX. It's just the other way around. So we have slightly bigger than Title IX level gender gaps on college campuses, just reversed. And I just think we need to update our policies and initiatives and programs to the data. And it's hard to do when it changes that fast. It's a bit like the needles on a compass swinging around. So wait, I thought north was south. What's happening here? We're talking about gender equality that way around? Really? Sorry? It's hard. But given the data that you've just cited and that we're talking about here, I think it's necessary because if we as institutions aren't addressing those issues and we're not trying to answer these difficult questions, then someone will go and try and find people who are answering those questions, probably online. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that our answers are going to be better than the answers they're likely to find online. Although, of course, we're online too with AIBM.org.
So one of the things that I've heard about your work, and congratulations on getting the website launched and getting the Institute up, is that you have really focused on what can we do. So highlighting the issue and then coming up with strategies for things that we can do differently, both at K-12 level, in society, and in higher ed. So would you share some of those with us? Yeah, so
I'll have to be honest here because one of the things I really want to do in my work and the Institute is to try and carry out evidence-based policy making, right? We hear a lot of that phrase, particularly in policy wonk circles, but very often what we honestly get a lot of the time is policy-based evidence making. All right, like I've got this policy, you better go and prove it's working, right? And the difficulty is that because we're still in the early days, I think, of really recognizing this as a problem, there aren't that many initiatives that have explicitly set out to improve outcomes for boys and men in education, let alone that have been evaluated well enough for us to say hand on heart, oh, that works. All of that said, I think there is some low-hanging fruit here, such as the declining share of male teachers in K-12. It was 33% of male teachers in 1980 when Ronald Reagan came to office. It's now 23%, 10-point drop. Declining share of men in caring professions as well. And actually on college campuses where we now know that controlling for everything else, being male is the biggest risk factor for not completing college, which I don't need to tell you, but actually just having more resources. So a couple of colleges now have got men's resource centers. They're trying to sort of reach out to men, help them with the study skills that they may not have come out of high school with, and just explicitly trying to help them. By the way, I don't join with the people who say we should get rid of the women's resource centers that we find on almost every campus. They're wonderful institutions, but I think it's now time to think about having ones for men as well. And the last thing I'll say is more investment in vocational and technical forms of training, which obviously can help boys and girls, but seem to particularly benefit boys and men.
So there has been a little work done early on with President Obama starting My Brother's Keeper, focusing on African American men, and that was the initiative that was started here in Seattle. So some things that are happening around mentoring, better support systems, but extrapolating that to the broader male community has not really happened. And I will tell you, when I started an African American male program at Seattle Central, I was actually the recipient of a lawsuit from an African American women's group saying that I was discriminating against the women on campus by offering support services. And we offered internships and mentoring and academic enrichment programs for the boys on campus, because what we recognized from the data was that African American men at Seattle Central had the lowest graduation rates. And so when we were looking, the state has something in our community and technical college system called Guided Pathways, and we were starting with the end in mind and thinking about what we wanted for every student was to graduate. And if we could target those who were having the worst outcomes, that we could raise our rates. And by doing that, we were the subject of a civil rights suit.
All right, well, good for you for doing it anyway. But I think it shows you this difficulty that people have around zero sum, and even President Obama, I think, had some of that when he did My Brother's Keeper. But the evidence on the particular outcomes on a number of measures for black boys and men, I think, is just unignorable. And it's one of the big things that our institute will be working on. And I'll go as far as this. I think in education, it's borderline irresponsible just to use racial categories without also breaking by gender. And I think that's particularly true when it comes to black boys and black girls. So you will see very often, and it's not quite as strong in the data here actually, but in other states, massive gender gaps in things like on-time high school graduation rates, that particularly for between black girls and black boys. You already mentioned HBCUs and minority serving institutions. They're already 2/3 female. So in some ways, they're ground zero. Like they're where the other institutions are heading. And so really grappling with it now. And so I think the ability to think intersectionally about that's very important. Where it gets a bit more difficult, depending on the audience you're talking to, is when you say, you know what, there are some issues where actually it's particularly lower income or working class white boys or men who seem to be particularly struggling. Maybe not most, but some. And I would mention risk of suicide as an example of that. Now, it's also true that there are some differences by race across that as well, but easily the biggest gaps you see are around between working class white men and other men. And so I guess what that is a plea for is to just look at the data without prejudice as to what you knowing in advance what you're going to find, and then we should tailor policy accordingly. And so what that means is massive investments in the way that we're currently disinvesting in the education of many black boys and men, and also sometimes I think under-celebrating some of the gains that have been made by black girls and women. Not that it's in any way there yet, but do you know what I mean? Like, by just collapsing it into one category of race without breaking by gender, I think we do an injustice in some ways to the progress that many black women have made, and we neglect some of the problems that black boys and men still face.
Absolutely. So we wanted to leave time for questions, and we're
all right for a bit.
We're up for that. Okay. So I'm going to try and make sure I call on people.
My name is Karen Kalish.
What I'm going to do is take a mic just so everyone can hear, and then we'll share maybe.
Okay, thanks. My name is Karen Kalish, and I recently moved to Seattle, but have been involved in education. So I love seeing you on Sunday. Were you on CBS Sunday morning
Yes.
or 60 Minutes?
CBS Sunday morning, yes.
Great job.
Yeah, on
Great
Sunday.
job.
I know.
Yep,
I know. I
2
timed
days
it.
ago.
Yeah, it was deliberately timed. It wasn't. It really wasn't.
It was great.
It was lovely.
I started a teen leadership program in St. Louis for black and Jewish high school students in 1994, and I went to all of their graduations, and I remember seeing the top 10 students on the stage. 9 were women and 1 was a man, and it just never dawned on me until I heard you on Sunday and read some things, and coming here to read that I realized there was something going on in the 90s. So it's not something recent. 10 years later, I started another program in St. Louis, this time in St. Louis, that was in DC, for struggling kids, because so many of them are behind when they come to school, And so we started training, supporting, and paying teachers in the lowest performing schools to go to the homes of their students to get their parents engaged in their education. They went to many more boys' homes than they went to girls. And the data showed that that relationship between mom, dad, grandma, and teacher, and school and home is so important and makes such a difference with these boys.
Yes.
So my question is, have you looked at and seen what the effect of mom, dad, grandma, home, family is to this whole problem with boys over girls?
So, first of all, thank you for your work. It sounds amazing. I'm very happy to pass the mic too. But it turns out that any programs which focus on family functioning, neighborhood poverty, and particularly these relational things, or what social scientists call social capital, like the links between within families and within communities, help all kids, especially poorer kids, but they help poor boys especially. And so you see things like the Becoming a Man program in Chicago. You'll see that boys do tend to be a bit more isolated socially very often. I mean, we had a question about the role of fathers, etc. And it just looks like in those vulnerable situations, all kids suffer, but the boys suffer even more. And so what that means is that male disadvantage takes on a bit more of an intergenerational quality, because if the boys are struggling, then they don't do well in the labour market, which means maybe their family aren't going to do very well, which means their boys struggle. It's not to say that female disadvantage isn't also intergenerational, it's just that it's a bit more true for boys. And so one of the things that I'm at pains to say to people, this is my attempt to be really non-partisan, is that if you really care about boys and men, you've got to care about poverty and inequality and the quality of the schools that are serving our least advantaged kids. And then I'll say to other people, if you really care about poverty and inequality and economic opportunity, you've really got to care about boys and men, because they are the ones who are both being hurt most by poverty and are predicting future poverty as well. And so maybe there's hope there that we could actually, cross some of the partisan lines.
Right. So, question over there and then here.
I work at a men's shelter on the east side called Porch Light. And I'm curious about, we see a lot of antisocial behavior at the shelter, predictably. And aside from the test scores and the advanced courses that kids take in school, there's something else that happens in school, which is socialization. They're learning how to interact with each other, how to have good relationships, how to make friends, how to be learning about things like consent in relationships. And I'm curious if any of your work centers on that side of things, the things that are harder to quantify, how do young men build relationships, how do they learn how to express themselves properly, so that the antisocial behavior that develops early on doesn't become a lifelong problem.
Yeah. Again, thank you for your work. The couple of things I believe perhaps almost more strongly than anything else in my life are the following. Number one, which is not directly relevant to what you're saying, but is important, which is that it is a universal human need to feel needed, which is why the two words that men use to describe themselves before they take their own lives by suicide most commonly are useless and worthless. So if you don't feel needed, you feel surplus to requirements, it's literally fatal. The second thing is, young people believe their eyes, not their ears. Right? I just think like a pedagogy, a curriculum for social and emotional learning, I mean, good, but they look around at how the adults in their lives are behaving. They learn by seeing. And I think particularly boys, adolescent boys, who are coming to terms with what it means to become a man. And I'm not saying girls don't have to go through similar transitions too, but I do think it's a bit of a more fragile process for boys. I've come to believe that, which means that the men they see around them in the classroom, on the playing fields, in the house next to them, in the church, in the synagogue, wherever, absolutely massively critical. And so what I will say is I'm convinced by the evidence that these relationships really matter, and I'll finish with the social science point, which is from Raj Chetty's work at Opportunity Insights. It's one of the most interesting social science findings in recent years, is that, and this is specifically about black neighborhoods actually, where they find that black boys living in neighborhoods where there are more black fathers around do better in life, even if their own father is not around. That last point's the crucial one. Having dads around helps boys even if their own dad's not around. And so now if you ask Raj or anybody else, and Alana Williams, who's our associate director standing there at the back, used to work with Raj, I think she'd agree with this. Why is that? What's the causal arrow? He would honestly say, we have no idea. We're just describing it. But I think we can intuit that there's just something about boys, especially, being around men who are providing pro-social role models just being important. That's one of the reasons why I'm so obsessed, honestly, with things like teachers and so on, because they'll follow. They'll look and they'll follow.
Can I just add?
Please.
That some of the work on disproportionality and discipline that's happening in our schools also points to what you mentioned in terms of the socialization that happens in classrooms, and that a lot of times boys of color are suspended disproportionately because they are not able to sit still, or they're not socialized in the same way that little girls are. And that's why it's also so important to have more male teachers and more teachers of color,
yes,
who are not making judgments about a student who can't sit still.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Hi, I'm Alonda Williams. I'm the president and CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters of Puget Sound. And we struggle with recruiting mentors, boys, men, and especially men of color. So we did some research, and we have a lot of data, both nationally and locally. And we had a very interesting finding. We asked men of color why they did not want to mentor or didn't feel like they, just what's the barrier? And overwhelmingly, they said they didn't feel equipped to be a mentor. They felt that they did not, that they could use a mentor themselves, which was really fascinating because we didn't see that in any other group. And so my question to you is, it sort of goes a little bit to the socialization, and I'm curious about what efforts are there to support men of color, in addition to the boys, but if we need more, what you said about the fathers, I think that's fascinating, but are there any efforts underway that you know of nationwide or aware of where there's a focus on strengthening boys? We partner with Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, and the fraternities are doing a really great job. And so we have a group mentoring program with them, both in Tacoma, and we're building it here in King County. And I guess it just seems like there's an opportunity to support men in addition to the boys. Like supporting the men would help the boys. I'm just curious if you have any data or any examples of that kind of work.
Right. Well, not many, to be honest. I mean, there are some good mentoring programs. I've mentioned one already, Becoming a Man. But it's interesting. So many of these organizations are saying we can't get the men to be the volunteers or the mentors for the boys. And interestingly, since the Boy Scouts went co-ed, that problem's accelerated. But I sort of think like they maybe could have seen that coming. And unless there are like specific roles that I think we're asking men to fill, then I think many of them do back away. But I'm very interested. We'd love to learn more about your research. Honestly, please share it. But I think there might be something very interesting culturally going on there, which is that I do feel like a lot of men do feel somewhat dislocated by the current culture, what their role is, etc. And then you come along and say, oh, well, you'd be a great mentor or coach or role model for those boys. But men are like, well, I'm not sure I would actually. I've got issues, right? Maybe I've got substance abuse issues and I'm struggling with my kid. And like, they almost don't feel worthy to do that. And then women will then step in quite often to do that. And so then you've got really quite a dangerous vicious circle. Because if the men don't feel like they're good enough to do it. And so one of my pleas to people, and actually it's going to sound like I'm telling you all to go and look at my TED Talk. But you should all go and look at my TED Talk. But at the end of it, at the end of it, I was asked, Chris Anderson asked me, he said, well, what would you say? Like, what's your message? And one of the things I said was like, and I'll say it to all of you now, there is all the men especially, there is a boy or a young man in your life who, when you call him later, or you just look him in the eye twice and ask not only how are you, but now how are you really, and how can I help, won't benefit from that. There's a huge gap of role models and mentors the lives of boys. And there's a huge lack of purpose and agency among many men. Well, that feels like we could potentially kill two birds with one stone if we could make those men feel better about it. So I'd love to talk about how we do that, but thank you for sharing.
And I'd like to see us do more for what I call the average boys.
Yes.
Because there are so many programs that are intervening with boys who are in the criminal justice system or boys who are at risk. But just, the average everyday kid, there aren't programs for those boys. And Alice started out by talking about her brother. I have 6 brothers. So,
Wow.
Yes, a lot of them, including one that's a set of twins. And they were just average kids. They're good kids. They weren't, like superstar athletes. They weren't superstar academics. They're just everyday kids. And there was nothing for them because they weren't athletes or they weren't in trouble, so there wasn't a program for them. So there's nothing for just average everyday kids. And so as you were doing your work with the Boys and Girls Club,
And wasn't it interesting that Dan's data showed that a lot of those gaps were bigger in the middle? Actually, I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. It's the kids in the middle who are not getting anything. There is a program here in Seattle for helping dads become better at, so mentoring fathers to become better fathers. And that's the only one that I know of here in Tacoma, in Seattle.
Sorry, Sheila, it's a hard choice.
Okay, and this actually has to be the almost the last one because I've got to go to another event. So maybe we'll take 2. The woman in the teal, and then this guy right here in front of her, and then that's going to, I have an event that starts
Good follow-on. Hi, this is Ann Stone, and I staff the Washington State Fatherhood Council.
Oh, yes.
And there are, hi, Richard.
Hi.
There are multiple programs in our state that help dads, but nowhere near enough. And one of the things we talk a lot about is social isolation, because dads are socialized, men are socialized to believe that they got to take care of business, right? They got to pay the bills, they got to be the one in the know, and it's not okay to ask for help. I mean, there's all this cultural socialization that really isolates men. So there's this study on happiness that looks at the difference in gender, in social connections. And one of the things they ask is, for men, how many of you have a guy that you can talk to, a person that you can turn to, that is there for you? And half of men said, I don't have anybody.
That's right.
And so people will say to us, well, men don't want to get together. They don't want to come together. Like when women come together with book groups and baby groups, and that's absolutely not true. That is not true, because when we bring men together, the roof goes up. They want to talk so much, but they want to come together for a purpose, right?
Right.
They want to come together to talk about how I can help somebody else not go through what I went through, or all of that. So it is about social connections, and I think it starts super, super early. And one of the things we haven't talked about, there was a little bit of a question in the beginning about data coming into school, but honestly, kindergarten readiness data, we are already behind with boys when they hit the kindy door. But one of the things that we're talking about is, can we wait a year? Because boys' brains do mature later than girls' brains do. So talk about that as an educator or people who are thinking about how do we catch up? Well, we start behind. Those first 3 years are so powerful, and the first 5 are so important. So if we start behind, we stay behind, is what the data says.
Okay, well, I think you managed to wrap 3 questions into that, Anne, which is great. So I went, yes, social connections, hugely important. Again, some of the work that has been done on social capital, including by my former colleague Camille Bousset, shows that men are more socially isolated, and especially black men. She looked at a bunch of cities. The latest work from Daniel Cox shows that 15% of men under the age of 30 say they have not a single close friend. That's up from 3% in 1990. Now, why? We could just roll our eyes and say, well, they should just get out and get one. What's happening there? And part of it, I think, is the second point, which is institutionally, just in the interest of brevity, I'll have to stereotype horribly, but men are friends with each other when they're pretending to be doing something else, right? There's no other explanation for golf. Literally none. And so, or fishing, or whatever. Choose. And so, shoulder to shoulder rather than face the shoulder to shoulder thing. I agree. That's right.
I did a lot of work on that.
I know the shoulder to shoulder work, and it's true that like, and I have a whole riff about that, which is that those communication styles are a bit different. So yes, we need institutions and places where men can do it. We shouldn't be automatically suspicious of male spaces and find a place for them to do that. And I totally agree about kindergarten. One of my proposals is that we should consider starting boys in school a year later. The trouble is that you say that and all the rich people go and do it, whose kids don't really need to do it, and the poor people can't afford to do it, right? But actually those are the boys who would benefit most. But given that boys do, on average, I think develop a little bit later, especially in adolescence, I certainly think it's something we should be looking at. And one of the reasons I'm even more convinced about that is because so many private schools do it. It's almost a default in some private schools for boys to go in a little bit later, because guess what? They figured out that it helps the boys do better. And so as a general rule of thumb, see what the upper middle class are doing, all right, and see whether that shouldn't be something other people should benefit from as well.
And then one last question there.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Blair Daly. I live in Redmond. I'm the founder of Washington Initiative for Boys and Men. Hi, Richard. Washington Initiative for Boys and Men. So I think bringing about some of the changes that you are wanting to bring about will require advocacy. I think it will require high quality, organized, serious advocacy. You know, we talk about how lobbying accomplishes things, special interest groups accomplish things. What's it going to take to get more people interested in helping advocate for these things? Secondly, I want to acknowledge that State Representative Mary Guy is with us here tonight, who has sponsored a bill related to this.
Yeah, okay. I thought I knew where you were going with that, Blair. WIBM, right, rather than AIBM. But do check out both. And actually, before I forget, we are going to close, I think, in a minute. So there are some snacks at the back. Please stay. Please go to our website. Please get our newsletter and stay in touch with what we're doing. But yeah, I think we're at a point now where the data, especially when you look at it through the lens of race and class and everything, the data is sufficiently strong that there are enough issues that seem to be specifically or more disproportionately affecting boys and men, that there's a need for institutions who focus on those in a non-partisan way, in a non-zero-sum way. I mean, I would say that, wouldn't I? I've just bet my career on building a think tank to do just that. But I think that needs to be in government as well. And you've mentioned Representative Dye and the bipartisan bill that's going to get a reconsideration to create a commission on boys and men in Washington state. There is, of course, a commission on women created in 2018, doing some good work and looking at the issues that are specifically affecting women and girls in the state. I think Washington state has the opportunity to show that we can do two things at once, that it's not zero-sum, and that there is no backing away from the work that needs to be done on behalf of women and girls, while simultaneously acknowledging the problems of boys and men. Like if Washington state could actually move on legislation like that, following in the footsteps of the only other place I know in the world that's done it so far is Norway, has a commission on boys and men. I think that would be a real move. There's so much interest in this issue. There's so many people that are leading on this issue. But I think it's now time that we built some of this into government and into institutions in the way that this commission might be able to do. I don't want to oversell what it could achieve, but I think symbolically, particularly a state like this, could actually be a real leader. And there's so many people that are tired of the zero-sum, one side or the other side bullshit. Are
we allowed to say that?
I don't know. I wasn't sure. That's why I hesitated. But he can edit it out later. That just showing that, like, yes, we can do two things at once, and yes, we can in a non-polarizing way. Just take these issues seriously and compassionately and empirically. It shouldn't be as controversial as it currently is, and I hope that one day it won't be. But it will take people like you and Representative Dye and others to lead the way.
Great. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So we have the room until 7 o'clock. So let's eat up all the food and make some new connections. And I want to thank you all for giving up some of your evening and joining us, and look forward to working together in the future.
Thank you.